Are we born inherently good or unquestionably evil? And is it even possible to heal the psychopathic mind? If you're curious about my answer to this question, then one of two things is probably happening inside of you. Either you're thinking of an evil person that you know or have unfortunately been exposed to, or number two, you're actually at that stage on your inner work journey where you're reflecting about your own personal malevolence. This question of evil is a really unsettling but important question, especially when you start to reflect, as I said, at that psychological level of self-healing on all of the unkind, malevolent, manipulative, and terrible things that you've done to both yourself and other people, even if it's just behind the private wall of your imagination. We can't escape the question of good and evil as humans today, and I've spent the last 2 weeks reflecting on this topic. Ultimately, I've done my best to condense a wide range of philosophy and psychology and personal one-on-one experience, helping people to heal from literally quite evil exposures during their childhood and adulthood, into something which is hopefully quite practical for you, especially as you address the question of evil out there and evil in here, because that is the ultimate simplistic way of framing a very philosophically complex question, which has captivated humanity for thousands of years. I'm not going to be the sole expert, but fortunately, I don't need to be, because we're going to be drawing upon Meeting the Shadow essay collection, which is 65 essays by some of the best psychologists that I've ever read. It's an absolute classic in the space. I've held it up many times on this channel, and there's a particularly good section, Section 7, which has 6 essays in a row specifically devoted to the question of personal evil. And they're well-written essays. I'm going to read a few different quotes here and there. It's going to frame our conversation, and hopefully we'll condense this back down to Diane's question, hopefully give her a response to this question. How many times can I say question in the video? Are we born good or evil? And what can we do to heal the evil inside and outside of us? Let's go straight into the book. Quote from the book, written by Rollo May. This particular essay, he's a fantastic thinker. He also wrote the book Love and Will, which I recommend you read. Rollo May says, quote, "The individual who wishes to have an answer to the problem of evil, as it's posed today, has need first and foremost of self-knowledge. That is, the utmost possible knowledge of his own wholeness. He must know relentlessly how much good he can do and what crimes he is capable of, and must beware of regarding the one as real and the other as illusion. Both are elements within his nature, and both are bound to come to light in him, should he wish, as he ought, to live without self-deception or self-delusion." Rollo May really frames this nicely. We come to the question of shadow work. Of course, this book is about the shadow. I've covered this topic many times on this channel. I've got a 12-episode series called Shadow Work Essentials. That's how this channel started. The shadow is not just the darkness and the malevolence, but anything which is outside of consciousness to varying degrees. It can also include your golden shadow, the highest potential that you are actually a little bit allergic to, but gradually coming in. We work at both directions and all depths. That is shadow territory. Rollo's particularly focused here on the nature of goodness and evil, which operates in the conscious aspects of our awareness. This is the understanding, and if you reflect honestly, and this is going to be pretty intense as a reflection, if you reflect honestly on some of the worst things that you've ever done, actually, that's too vague, the worst thing that you've ever done. Someone watching this video has killed someone. Someone else has severely hurt someone. Many people have cheated on partners. Many people have been abusive or mean to their children in moments of lacking consciousness or stress. People have hurt their bodies in unthinkable ways with drugs and razor blades and cigarettes and all these horrible things. That's the evil that we have the potential to get swept up in. You and I are watching this video right now, and if you are, well, I'm not watching the video, I'm actually making the video, but I'm right there with you, I guess. That's why I said that. If you're reflecting on these things and you're in contact with that evil without being swept up all the way into an evil persona where you confuse that for being the whole of your identity, but you can remain open in that tension, then let's stay with this, because that's a really important feeling that we need to bear in mind when considering the psychopathic nature of people who exist in reality beyond our personal space. Let's continue with a different quote from a different author. Here we're moving on to a wonderful quote from Scott Peck. And Scott Peck was a criminal psychologist. At least he worked with criminal populations for, I think, 20 years. That's when he's writing this essay. I think this book was written in the 90s, but 20 years at this point, working with criminal populations, so he knows a thing or two about psychopaths. This is his conclusion. Here's the golden quote. The essential component of evil is not the absence of a sense of sin or imperfection, but the unwillingness to tolerate that sense. At one and the same time, the evil are aware of their evil and desperately trying to avoid that awareness. Rather than blissfully lacking a sense of morality like the psychopath, they are continually engaged in sweeping the evidence of their evil under the rug of their own consciousness, sweeping the evidence of their evil under the rug of their own consciousness. Beautiful sentence. The problem is not a defect of consciousness, but the effect and the effort to deny that conscious is due. Let's continue to the final paragraph of the essay. Again, very heavily highlighted book. I recommend you get this copy before it sells out. I've already received messages that many books I recommend on this channel are no longer available, so if you want to get one of the last several dozen copies of this that may exist in your country, please get the book now, literally right now. Final quote, come back to the question of evil. What do we do about this? Well, not much is Scott's conclusion ultimately, because the psychopath is not the person who is willing to go to therapy. Under ordinary circumstances, the evil are the last people who would ever come to psychotherapy. The evil hate the light of goodness that shows them up, the light of scrutiny, key phrase, the light of scrutiny that exposes them, the light of truth that penetrates their deception. Psychotherapy is a light-shedding process par excellence. Except for the most twisted motives, an evil person would be more likely to choose any other conceivable route than the psychotherapist's couch. The submission to the discipline of self-observation required by psychoanalysis does, in fact, seem to them like suicide. Final sentence. The most significant reason we know so little scientifically about human evil is simply that the evil are so reluctant to be studied. Goosebumps down my spine. It's a really disturbing place to focus into, and it creates this very upsetting gap, I'll say it that way. When we encounter information like this and we see examples of the psychopathics who are out there, and we don't have enough information about the middle ground, the spectrum from good to evil, the ambiguity and the moral vagueness of what it means to be either, especially when there's cultural definitions, there might be absolutes, I would say. In most cases, killing is evil, and yet there are cases where you kill to defend, you kill to protect. At what point does a child murderer forfeit their right to life in this society? Is killing a good thing at that point if you prevent more children suffering? Many questions. It's thousands of years old, this question. Where does it relate to something that we can make practical for you in this moment? As Rollo May and Scott Peck pointed out, the difference between the evil, the fundamentally evil people, and those who have aspects of evil inside themselves which they come into contact through active imagination or parts work, is the willingness to shine the light of self-scrutiny, that light of truth upon the parts which are clearly malevolent. It's one of the biggest breakthroughs in shadow work that I notice with clients that I'm working with, when we can bring out piece by piece. And this is a very interesting moment in a conversation, because we don't have these kinds of conversations in normal, everyday environments at the office or the gym. When you encourage someone to really work through the private desires that led them to, say, cheat on their partner, or led them to abuse themselves with a tool or a substance or something horrific, you peel back a lot of the shame, you peel back the guilt, you peel back the rage which covered up the sadness, which covered up the wound that wasn't resolved from earlier in their life. And you often encounter very, very hurt and very sore parts inside of people. And there are many different ways to respond to that. You can cause injury to self, you can cause injury to other. It's fundamentally a question of insecurity, but that doesn't actually make a healing impact on those who are outside of that awareness, that would even accept that there could be something that is insecure or hurt inside of them. The psychopath is truly the person who is unwilling, in all capitals, unwilling to look at the areas of weakness that they are running from, and therefore they must enter into these master and slave, domination, submission, winner and loser, constant attacking downwards dynamics. And if someone appears here, let's say a boss in a company and the psychopath is at the middle manager level, they will do everything that they can to try and attack that boss, and of course they get fired. And the psychopath need not be the person who is, going out and doing all these crimes. They can be around us. I don't think the clinical terminology is too useful, in the same way that I would avoid labeling someone as a narcissist or labeling someone as a codependent. I don't like the limitations of that language, but for the sake of this conversation, we can see the clear difference between you and I and the psychopathic person who isn't willing to watch a video on inner work and self-reflective healing. People sometimes get worried when they're in a session with me that speaking towards the evil that they have been in contact with inside of themselves, even if they're a very good person, they are the sweetest girl or the most moral man, to admit in their private imagination that they've thought of doing something very degrading towards their romantic partner, or that they have a certain desire to cause ultimate harm to a family member, it depotentiates the charge. The integration of the shadow in this moment is to take away the forbidden and the shameful in a safe container where it's being spoken through and it's being de-animated. The psychopath, unlike you and I, is not capable of de-animating or withdrawing all of that libidinal energy which charges their malevolence. They need to protect that, because that's their source of pseudo-power against the fragility which they reject. Hope you're following here. Unlike the psychopathic person, we're in contact with a much deeper source of power, which means that we actually accept that we are indeed, full video, comes to the sentence, we are indeed both good and evil in various proportions, depending on the context and the direction of life that we choose to maintain. Key phrase there, the direction of life that we choose to maintain. A good person can have evil moments, and an evil person can have good moments, but a truly psychologically mature way of doing your own inner work is realizing that you should not pay too much attention to the world around you ultimately. If you're concerned about the evil that's been done to you, and rightly so if you're a victim of abuse, rightly so if you went through a horrific circumstance, or maybe survived a war zone or a conflict zone, even just the conflict zones of some of the cities across the world right now. When you see the evil in the people who come to you and they have the knife, or they have the tongue, they have the way of attacking, and you receive that attack, you feel like evil has been done to you. But that's not within your power to actually change in that moment. What's within your power is to recognize the evil within yourself and stop focusing on the evil out there, but merely come into greater contact with the parts of you that are still insecure, covered up with rage, and covered up with malevolent, destructive response. There's one-to-one sessions where someone admits that they have cheated or have harmed themselves in a major way. are always difficult moments, but they do end with the light of awareness. The light is the purifying force which prevents the evil from concretizing in a form of external action which would hurt, harm, or otherwise manipulate another person in relationship. Just because we've received that energy from the world, in a moment of abuse, or a moment of terror, or we read the stories from history of great dictators and evil criminals who went way too far off the end of unconscious repression and did some of the most malevolent things that we could imagine, it doesn't mean that we are incapable of potentially slipping down that slope, but we also mustn't confuse the end point of their malevolence for our own malevolence. We can't collapse that space between and call it that one four-letter word, evil or good. They're both four-letter words. Evil, spelled backwards, is live, the cliche of its life. Lived backwards, that's evil. To sin is to miss the mark, from the original etymology of the archery term. Supposedly, religions deal with this question. Thousands of years. What's practical for you in this moment? It's the healing effect of accepting your goodness and your evil, but being detached from both. I can try my best in a session to be a good person, and yet perhaps when someone may share something, let's say that a woman shares how she got revenge on someone by doing something that was particularly crafty and very clever, and because what that person did in the past was so horrific, I have a moment where my shadow arises and I say, they deserved that. How evil was that moment? Was I the evil person in that evil conversation, sharing that evil moment where we're both plugging into a pseudo-powerful expression which covers up the fragility, where the bad that was done in the past is then met with a new bad done in the present, and then I come in and say, yes, you did a good job there because an eye for an eye, and you fight fire with fire. Sometimes that happens within the privacy of my own mind, but the way that I could handle it in a conversation would be, you know what, Miss Client, I had such a strange reaction there. When you said that, there was a part of me that almost started to smile. It was almost like a demonic element came through where, very rightly so. And yet, at the same time, I don't believe that in my fullness. It's such a tragedy that this series of events has led to the moment where you would do something like this. I don't know what to make of it. What do you think? And then that kind of reflection, that kind of modeling, where I see my internal duality and it's mirrored in the therapeutic space, then allows that moment of opening inside of them, where the light of awareness, temporarily held by me, and then inspired within the client themselves, starts to shine into their own unconscious, and they can see that they are not born inherently good or inherently evil, because their actions have elements of both, depending upon their level of awareness. Don't know where we're going with that in terms of answering the question about psychopaths, but I can't avoid talking about my own experience. And my experience of helping people heal from personal evil is truly a question of awareness. We can't get an ultimate solution unless you want to go into the spiritual space, and sure, there's ideas about souls incarnating for a certain life path. You can go here and there and everywhere in regards to, did a certain German dictator's soul come down to create a catalyst moment in World War II, which would then lead to a global united effort in the sense of globalism, which then becomes the foundation for the New Age and global consciousness 500 years later? I don't know. I don't think it's a useful conversation. The useful conversation is the practical conversation, and it's not worth reading dead philosophy and unanimated psychology books that deal in clinical terms when we have access to the goodness and the evil at even the smallest level of spectrum, the smallest thread between the two in our day-to-day life. The question of evil is a personal question, and only you in this moment have access to all of the evil, malevolent, and malicious things that you have done or thought of doing to others. Of course, as sane, moral adults, we try and live from a heart-based perspective where we don't do wrong to other people. But the deeper that you go into your own self-awareness, the deeper that you're going to see just how much harm that you can do. One of the most important shadow work practices for me happened on my birthday during a 3-day fast, I think 3 or 4 years ago, where I reflected on my birthday, weird as this is, on the worst case outcome of gaining reputation and status and doing this path I'm on right now, and where I would take that if I was focused on the evil way rather than the good way. Placeholder terms, but I went into those spaces in my active imagination and I saw all the material trappings and all of the scandal that I could get into and chose not to do it. You play it out in fantasy, you play it out with a therapist, and then you see that that's not what you want. That's really not what you want, especially if that was initially a power play where you were covering up some kind of insecurity. This is the classic situation with a leader who gets power hungry. They're trying to prove something to themselves. And if the security of your heart and the confidence of your mind and the clarity of your soul can all come together to make good, righteous, ethically aligned choices 95% of the time, but to still accept the scintilla of evil that will always operate behind the scenes and try to not go down that path, that is something like a righteous way of living. The psychopath may be, unfortunately, the result of childhood trauma, which leads them to a point where they can't access that level of internal flexibility. But you're not a psychopath, and neither am I. We can focus on what we can do right now, and that's ultimately all we can ever do. I highly recommend that you pick up this book for yourself. Once more, there's probably only a limited number of copies left in the world because it's an old, out-of-date print. So if you do want your copy, go onto Amazon or your favorite secondhand bookseller and get a copy before it's gone, because might as well. Books are always fun. That's it for this video. I'll see you over on the next one, and I can't remember what the next one is because I spent all of yesterday structuring the next 10 episodes and they're all kind of blurred together, but that's the next one, and I'll see you over there.